Friend Senator Rob Portman from the great state of Ohio. Senator Portman, welcome back. So,
Larry,
I presume you heard Hillary. Maybe you heard my riff, maybe not. But let's go to this permitting bill. It kind of looks like it's not going to pass. 5 Democrats in the Senate against it. All the progressives in the House against it. What's your take on this, sir?
I think there's a simple solution, Larry, and that's to come up with a bipartisan package here. We didn't get any of the language with regard to Joe Manchin's proposal until the last couple of days. We are now trying to figure out what's in it. As you've probably seen, a lot of people from the outside who've looked at it aren't sure if it helps or hurts. I think there's some good things in it. I also think there's some things that need to be improved, but it was never done in a bipartisan way. So let's do the very simple thing that we should have done at the start. Let's have a bipartisan permitting reform bill. As you know, I'm a hawk on permitting reform. It's one of the huge problems we have in this country, relative to just about every country in the world, by the way. It takes us longer to green light something. Energy projects, yes, but any kind of construction, including infrastructure, roads and bridges. We did a pretty good job in the infrastructure bill of moving the ball forward. Now we can do more. But let's do it on a bipartisan basis. So there's time to do that. Let's get this spending bill done if that's necessary to get done first. But let's sit down, get a bipartisan bill that has some of the good ideas that are in Shelley Moore Capito's proposal and Joe Manchin's proposal, some things that others of us would like to have, and let's get it done. And we can. All we need is 10 Democrat votes.
Think how I feel. I ran the NEC for 3 years. The permitting reform, the NEPA reforms came from our council, for heaven's sake. So, you know, read it and weep, Larry. But listen, I thought the Capito bill and also Dan Sullivan's bill, using the regulatory review, actually got, I think it won. In fact, Manchin voted for the Sullivan bill at one point. There's your, I mean, bipartisanship is a relative phrase, but I bet you could pick up a couple. I mean, Joe Manchin might wind up voting Capito bill and put that together with Sullivan's bill. You might have some serious regulatory reform. Otherwise, Senator Portman, I think it's going to go down. Either that or we're going to have to play a silly game about, you know, shutting down the government, which is really a silly game.
Yeah, it really is, and there's no need to do that. There could be a clean continuing resolution to make sure that doesn't happen. But on permitting reform, remember, we've done this in the past, though. You mentioned the council, the Permitting Reform Council that your administration took seriously, was a bipartisan effort. I worked on it for about 8 years. We got it done. It helps move the time frame from approximately 6 years on average to about 2 years on average to permit a project of all kinds. Energy, by the way, green energy and fossil fuels. It should apply to everything. Building construction, roads and bridges, all of it.
By the way, without permitting reform, I would predict, sir, that you're not going to get your wind farms because they dig up a lot of ground. They're huge undertakings, and you're going to need a million permits. If you don't have one federal decision, all these agencies and states are all going to run into it. So you won't even get your renewable fuels, much less your fossil fuels. All right, Senator Portman, let me move on.
Including, by the way, the critical minerals that are needed for electric car batteries, which are needed for what the Democrats want to do, which is to not have a transition, but just go immediately to electric cars. You can't do that if you don't have the ability to extract these minerals, and that takes permitting reform.
Right, you need minerals for the batteries, but, Senator, you need electricity in order to plug the battery in. They don't have electricity in California, so if you own an EV now, you can't plug it in. That's kind of I would call that lose-lose, but maybe that's another segment. Senator Portman, can we talk briefly about the allegedly boring topic of the continuing resolution? Because I want to know why the GOP senators, why wouldn't you all want to impose the pay-go caps, which are still out there, even though they get waived every year? Now, you're one of the few that probably understands this process, but 41 Republicans could force them to deal with the pay-go caps, which means anything you spend has to be paid for. And if not, then there's a sequester across the board. Wouldn't this be a good time? I mean, wouldn't it be great to say that the federal government is stopping its rampant spending and helping the Federal Reserve to cut inflation instead of being at odds and conflict by spending more while the Fed's trying to tighten money? Why not use pay-go?
Yeah, you could. This all comes, by the way, Larry, out of the $1.9 trillion we've talked about on the show before. So for people just to remember, almost $2 trillion spent to work on COVID. Most of it had nothing to do with COVID. Created a huge stimulus effect in the economy, which economists right, left, and center say has helped cause inflation on the demand side. But what happened was that money was spent even more rapidly than predicted. Therefore, there are pay-go rules right now that could come into effect that would actually require some of that to be offset. So I think that does make sense, probably not in the CR, because as you said, shutting down government does not make sense, and that's probably what would happen. But certainly with regard to the omnibus appropriation bill, the next bill, which is where you're going to have real money. This would be a sequester of mandatory spending under our rules. And the question is, is that something that Congress is willing to do, or could you sequester other funds instead? So, I mean, which would be on the domestic discretionary side. But I think it's a possibility.
I mean, remember what Reagan said a million years ago? No, not so long ago. If not us, who? If not now, when? Remember that line? It was a wonderful line. And it had to do with a lot of things. The way I look at federal spending, Senator Portman, if not us, who? And if not now, when? I mean, I don't really want to go through the games of shutting the government down. But as this CR is developing, wouldn't it be pretty good to go in there and say, hold on a second, there's no time like the present to do what we should have done a long time ago and start cutting back on federal programs. Because there's always something to stop us from using it. The waivers always seem to win. And we never get a federal budget anymore. As you well know, it's all a bunch of continuing resolutions. And that this thing will only go to mid-December. So a lame duck Congress could spend away after that, no matter who wins. I mean, I'm imploring you to think about pay-go. It's a very simple, lovely concept.
Yeah. The one thing that you and I think both agree on is that the pay-go rules, while it's a mandatory cutting of spending on the mandatory spending side, meaning Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, wouldn't it be better to reform those programs so that they actually save money and work better? So rather than doing sort of the across-the-board cut, let's actually reform these programs. And there is legislation to do that. I'm one of the co-sponsors. There are about 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans, not enough yet. But that's really what has to be done. And I know, you and I have talked about this before, but the vast majority of our spending, almost 70% now, is on autopilot. This is the mandatory spending. And that's the spending we don't want to touch because it's so difficult politically. But that's where the big increases are. And increasingly, that's where the money is.
Well, we could talk about these mandatory programs. That's another segment. We run out of time. I'm just saying, in the spirit of my former boss, Ronald Reagan, if not now, when? That's all I'm saying. Anyway, Senator Rob Portman, thank you very much, sir. As always, appreciate it.
Thanks, Larry.
All right.